Well, welcome everybody to this webinar of the HSBC Institute, where we're thrilled and privileged to have Liz Martins as our speaker to lead us through the maze of the UK's economy and what its prospects are. And this is part of a series that we've been holding in recognition of the fact that this is the 300th anniversary of the birth of Adam Smith, and this is the fourth talk in that series. Just to give you some additional background, is that our next event, which is next week, we'll be looking at artificial intelligence and the impact that that will have, with speakers on a panel from Edinburgh, Singapore, and Washington. And we continue to have other meetings going forward. And so to all of you listening to do that, we obviously look forward to receiving your financial help and support, because laying these events on requires a lot of effort by those doing them. And your support of us as a not-for-profit is going to be hugely important going forward. Now, so this discussion about the economy is going to be a very interesting one, and you'll have an opportunity after Liz has spoken to ask questions using the Q&A and chat function, which you'll find on your screens. By way of background, Liz joined HSBC 13 years ago now in their Dubai office, where she covered 15 Middle Eastern economies during the turbulent period of the Arab Spring, bringing HSBC's view on the region to clients across the world. In 2014, as she said, she stopped traveling so much, she moved to London office to join the global and European economics team in London. And since 2016, she's led the HSBC Bank Group's analysis of the UK economy, including the key task of navigating the economic landscape following the UK's vote to leave the EU. He holds a bachelor's and master's degree from Cambridge University, which is a very good thing because it's a very fine university. I also attended. So Liz, welcome. Thank you for being with us. And we'd very much like you to get us going by painting the picture of how you see the UK economy at the moment. And then we'll have some other questions for you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Roddy. And thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. I'm going to bring up some slides. I mean, really, what a topic. The UK economy in a changing world was the brief today, and that really does incorporate all kinds of different challenges and new realities. As an economist, the first one of those that sprang to mind was the new world of higher rates and inflation. So I'm going to touch on that. And then I thought as well about the challenge of policy and a possible new government come the end of next year, perhaps. And then some other challenges, including, Roddy, you mentioned AI. Let's maybe touch on that as a sneak preview today, and the challenge of net zero. So I'm going to try and cover all of those things. I'm sure I've left a lot out in terms of the changing world, and we can get to that. And please do, as Roddy said, submit your questions through the Q&A function. We'll have a go at absolutely anything. So let me start with that first. Biggest change, I suppose, in economic reality has been the rise in inflation. And I think, you know, like the 1970s, this has been something that actually has been building for a long time. You know, different people blame different things. We've got the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis. A lot of people blame QE. But actually, I think, you know, like the 1970s, what happened in the 1970s was people failed to notice that there had been insufficient growth in the supply side of the economy. There'd been insufficient investment. And so when we talk about, as economists, you know, we need to see productivity growth and supply side growth. You hear politicians talk about it all the time, but it hasn't really materialized in the post-global financial crisis period. We haven't seen the investment in the supply side that we needed to see. And then we've added into that a massive supply shock, actually two, in the form of the pandemic and Brexit. And no wonder we've entered a higher inflation world. Now, obviously, the good news on inflation is that the headline rate, the red line on this chart, has started to come down. So we peaked at 11.1%. You'd hope that it would come down from there, and indeed it has. The last reading was 6.8%. But what you'll notice on this chart, of course, and what you'll all be very well aware of already, is that the core inflation, so when we strip out food and energy, that line looks much more sticky, a much less convincing downturn. So when we had the most recent inflation release, and it was another drop down in the headline rate to 6.8%. And a friend of mine who's on a floating rate mortgage texted me and said, "Are you not happy now? Will this not do?" And the answer is, of course, from the Bank of England's perspective, no, it won't do, because actually that core inflation rate running at nearly 7% will not do at all. That is still much too high. Now you can see on the chart that our forecasts are for both core and headline inflation to continue to come down, but also to stay above the Bank of England's 2% target and above that kind of range from really only 0 to 2% for most of the last kind of 15 years. So we kind of feel that, that supply side impact is a lasting one. And I'll come on to talk about the labour market and the inflationary consequences of that as well. That has played a major role, and that will be with us for some time. I think it's probably too much to hope that beyond the impact of, yes, some parts of inflation are falling away, so things like shipping costs have come right back down, and natural gas prices have come right back down, and all those are good things. But that core inflation piece of the puzzle, the wage growth piece of the puzzle, the demand-driven piece of the puzzle, the immigration and the labour force piece of the puzzle, all of those are still very much with us. So we talk about the UK in a changing world, and I think this is a real feature of that changing world. And actually, it is, of course, not just us. Wherever you look around the world, show me a developed market economy and I will show you an economy where inflation is too high, where central banks have raised interest rates, where economies are struggling with those higher interest rates, where housing markets are slowing, where consumption is responding. It is not just us, but unfortunately, as this chart shows, it is particularly us in the UK. And you can see that the core inflation rate here not only is a bit higher, it's also had a less decisive downturn, particularly than the one we see in the US economy. So the question for the Bank of England, of course, is whether we can kind of, how low is low enough really on inflation, and the trade-off between continuing to raise rates until we're absolutely sure we're getting inflation back down to that 2% target, or kind of saying implicitly, maybe we can live with 3% for a couple of years in return for not crashing the economy. And the reason I've illustrated that with this lovely picture of a shower is because of this so-called fool in the shower analogy. It was originally Milton Friedman's, but it's more recently adopted and proposed by one of the members of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, Silvana Tenrero. So her theory is kind of around the shower. So you're in the shower and the water's coming out cold, so you turn the dial up, and you're still cold, so you turn the dial up again, it's still coming out cold, and you're starting to get frustrated, so you whack the dial all the way over, and then the hot water starts to come, and it's coming too fast now, and you're scalding yourself, and it's too late to turn it down. And she says that is exactly what the Bank of England is doing to the UK economy. We are in scalding territory, and all we have to do is wait for the first couple of turns to come through, and indeed that will reduce the inflation. And to that argument, that we are seeing signs of that. If you look at the surveys, they suggest that inflation pressure is coming off, even in the service sector, which has been where the hottest the heat has been in terms of demand and inflation and wages. But also there's been a turnaround in the labour market of late, and it's quite interesting. The labour market has been incredibly tight, but we had the unemployment rate has now risen from 3.5% a year ago to 4.3% now. The number of unemployed people in the UK is actually up 23%. The number of vacancies is down. Most of our customers in the bank, if we talk to them, will agree that having been incredibly tight, where to the point where you couldn't get staff and you couldn't retain staff and you couldn't recruit, and there was no one to hire, most of our contacts in business would agree that has really turned around. So it feels like lower wage growth, lower inflation pressure. It's all coming through the pipe. We just need to wait and not necessarily keep whacking up inflation just because the near-term numbers are coming out high still. So what does that mean for interest rates? Well, it kind of points to this table mountain approach, and this refers to the outlook espoused by Bank of England's chief economist Hugh Pill, and he said, you know, the trajectory of interest rates that we need to see is a table mountain approach. So those who've been to South Africa know what I'm talking about. You get the ascent, and then you get a sort of horizontal line for a long time. In other words, interest rates go to a certain level and they stay at that level for some time. And maybe the Bank of England is saying through that, you know, we're seeking to achieve through duration of higher interest rates, as opposed to achieve our aims of bringing inflation down through the duration rather than necessarily the magnitude. So if you were going to go to the letter of the law, maybe you'd keep on hiking. But if you maybe you do the same thing by having it slightly lower, but for a longer period of time. And, you know, that's our forecast too. And actually, we in the market for once are kind of in agreement. However, I can't tell you how many times I've unfortunately had to remake this chart because things have changed a lot and there are risks in both directions to that. And just to illustrate those changes, I put on the market expectations on different dates. So back in March, when we were all worried about Silicon Valley Bank and Credit Suisse, and we thought we might be on the verge of a global financial crisis, at that time, the market thought the Bank of England was done at 4.25. Then in July, on the back of you know, a particularly high inflation number, the market thought we were going to 6.50. So look, things change a lot and they change quickly. So, you know, we have to be a bit humble as economists about our predictions. Now, I only have to forecast to the end of 2024, but the market has expectations that go beyond that. And this chart illustrates those expectations. So you can see the market agrees, 550 feels about right as the peak, and no real easing until 2025. And even then, we're going down more towards the 4% area compared with the, you know, 0.5% area that we've been living with since the global financial crisis. Now, to me, this is a picture of success. Now, it might not make us happy if we're refixing our mortgages or thinking of, you know, taking out a big loan or, you know, whatever it is. But it's a picture of success. Why? Because if interest rates are only coming down at this pace, it's probably because demand is relatively strong, the economy is muddling through, inflation is still above target, but rates have not had to go up again, so it's not completely out of control. But if you think about when interest rates come down very, very rapidly, global financial crisis, March 2020, it's usually not for a good, happy reason. So I do think we have to be a bit careful what we wish for, in the sense of, you know, could rates come down? You know, we might want rates to go back down to 0.5% again, or those of us on the borrowing side of the economy might want it, the savers won't. But at the same time, you know, it may be that if that is the case, it's for bad reasons that very much offset the benefits of lower interest rates. So this is a picture of a muddle through scenario for the UK economy. It's a picture of an economy that can live in a higher inflation, higher interest rate world than the one that we have been used to. And I think it might be kind of the best that we're going to get. Now, in terms of living with those higher interest rates, I think the first thing, there's obviously the three channels by which higher interest rates affect us. One is the household sector, and we know that 2.4 million households will refix their mortgage between the end of, between, you know, the rest of 2023 and through 2024. Those households, 2.4 million out of about 28 million households in the UK overall, will bear the brunt of this monetary tightening. They will, you know, and it's one reason I think for the BOE not to go too much higher, because you're piling more and more pressure on a relatively small group of households. But look, I think for the vast majority of those households, it is absorbable. Why? Because in aggregate, the UK has had a pay rise of 8.5%, and because these households generally post-global financial crisis, lending has been much, much more stringent. So the average first-time buyer income is £54,000. The average remortgager income is £83,000. So yes, it's not nice when your mortgage goes up by, you know, a couple of hundred pounds a month, but it does feel like it's absorbable to households in the income bracket to have a mortgage in the first place. The next channel is how it affects corporations. And again, it's a bit of a muted impact for corporations because actually corporate leverage has fallen quite a lot since the global financial crisis, and of what corporate debt is out there, 10% is bounce back loans from the pandemic, and those are at a fixed interest rate of 2.5%. And also corporates have a lot of money on deposit, not least because of all the government subsidies they've received. So I'm not underplaying the impact of higher interest rates on households or companies, but I am saying that maybe the impact is a bit lower than it was last time interest rates were this high. However, my worry is that where the debt has transferred to is the UK government. So perhaps the biggest victim of higher interest rates might be the UK government, which starts off with debt just shy of 100% of GDP, and it's now servicing that debt at a much higher interest rate. A quarter of our national debt is linked to inflation. Of course, public sector pay is getting pushed up by inflation, pensions are getting pushed up by inflation, and the cost of servicing the debt is also getting pushed up by inflation, which leaves not very much room at all for any kind of loosening. And that's before you even get to things like, you know, the wish list, the state of the public finances at the moment, the NHS waiting list, the schools with crumbling concrete walls, the state of the prison service, as highlighted by recent news flow, the sewage in the waterways, and so on and so on. Spending to tackle all of those things isn't even really incorporated in this chart. Now, that is not to say that our government won't want to do something ahead of the election to try and close the gap with Labour in the opinion polls. And Rishi Sunak's talked about taking 2p off income tax. He's talked about abolishing inheritance tax. It is possible that he will want to do something like that come March if inflation is under control, because if it's not and interest rate markets are still volatile, you know, he will certainly not want to risk another mini budget style event ahead of the election. So I think it is possible that you get loosening, but I do think also the state of the public finances in general are make the options quite limited. And I think the Labour Party, who looks set to form the next government, I think they seem to understand that point, and they've been very keen to set out that they are the party of fiscal stability, that they will stick to a set of ironclad rules, that they are no longer the party of tax and spend, no longer the party of Jeremy Corbyn and that kind of economics. They are sounding a much, much more cautious note, at least on the public finances. But like I say, the wish list is long, and realistically, you know, some things haven't even been accounted for. And one of the things that any future government, well, is technically on the hook to commit to is reducing the UK's net emissions to zero. So another aspect of our changing world is this net zero policy, and we've had a little taster of how it all plays out politically here in London with the by-election result that seemed to focus heavily around the ULEZ tax. But, you know, getting to net zero is very expensive. This is the OBR's estimate. So they think basically it will cost £1.4 trillion by 2050. Which is the target date. They think the government will shoulder about a quarter of that burden. And of course, this is costly through lost tax revenues, lost fuel duty, lost vehicle excise duty, but also through the spending on buildings, on electric infrastructure, etc., etc. But they think, you know, it costs government 350 billion and adds 21% of GDP to the debt. So it looks very expensive and adds to the constraints on those public finances. On the other hand, so too does the cost of doing nothing with net zero. And this is just one example of the economic impact of climate change on global economies. So this is the cost of on labor productivity from higher temperatures. Now, obviously, currently very much focused in the hottest countries in Asia and in Africa, but certainly as time goes by could affect us in the UK more, and could also affect us, of course, through higher migration as different countries become less habitable than they once were. So all in all, a difficult picture for whoever is in government next, and realistically, whoever wins the election, and I do want to say this carefully, whether it is Labour or the Conservative Party, they may well find themselves thinking that tax rises are the least worst option. Now, as Liz Truss knew, the best possible way of funding public services is by growing the economy, growing the revenues, and that allows you not to have to do it by increasing borrowing or raising tax. And I will come on to the prospects for that in just a moment. But for now, let's be pessimistic for just a moment, and imagine that growth doesn't materialize, because after all, it hasn't. For successive governments that have talked about trying to bring that on. And if it doesn't materialize, then, as I say, I think governments will find themselves looking at raising tax. And even though the UK's tax has, of course, famously risen to its highest since 1948, actually, compared to some other countries, we don't look that overtaxed. And I think that may become the justification, again, for whoever is in power, barring that growth miracle. So it's now time for me to shoehorn a reference to the father of my profession and the founding father of the principle of these talks, Adam Smith, and a shout out to his 4 principles of taxation, which have absolutely stood the test of time, and whoever is in power would do well, I think, to keep all of these in mind when considering revenue raising measures. So they are, of course, fairness, certainty, convenience, and efficiency. I just want to dwell for a moment on fairness. There's a couple of areas which the Institute for Fiscal Studies has really highlighted recently. One is the penalty of being an employee versus self-employed in terms of paying much more national insurance. Philip Hammond tried to redress that in 2017, but he was forced to backtrack by the media campaign in defense of the white band man. And the other is the disparity between wealth and income. Now, obviously, wealth taxation, very controversial, very complicated, but at the moment, earning £40,000 from being a landlord is much, much more favourable in terms of what tax you'll pay than earning £40,000 as an employee. And that feels like it might violate that principle of fairness. And then just a shout out as well for the principle of certainty, because you think about the environment we've just been through. Last year we had Rishi Sunak came in, put the national insurance tax in, he put the corporation tax in. Liz Truss came in and took them back out again. Rishi Sunak came back and tweaked again. And I think what businesses and households value really is certainty. And I think we've been through a period of anything but certainty. So I do think that's these principles absolutely stand the test of time and should be a guiding light for whoever is in power next. But staying with the Labour Party for a moment, and staying with Adam Smith, actually, because I was quite interested. Of course, his more famous, even more famous than his wonderful principles of taxation, is his theory of the invisible hand. And what's interesting, of course, the invisible hand referring to the pure free market and pure capitalism. And actually, it feels like that might be going out of fashion just a little bit. So I was interested by Rachel Reeves' speech, of course, Labour Shadow Chancellor in America earlier this year, where she heaped praise on what the US government is doing in terms of a more active state, the government working in partnership with the market. And of course, this is referring to the US initiatives like the Inflation Reduction Act, like the CHIPS Act, and so on. Lots of subsidies, lots of kind of almost protectionism and with seemingly great results, as the chart on the right-hand side shows. The Inflation Reduction Act has resulted in a massive boom in investment, which should ultimately do what it says on the tin and reduce inflation. A debate to be had for sure about the role of government, but it feels like we are moving a little bit, much as Labour says we're not a party of tax and spend, towards a more active government role in the economy. But my final point is about productivity and growth, because of course productivity is the holy grail, and the piece of the puzzle that might resolve that fiscal challenge, the need for spending. If we had some good growth, maybe that would resolve it. And technology is clearly one answer to that puzzle. And I'm going to try and put a positive spin on it, actually, because much as we all worry about the impact of technology taking all our jobs, actually what it might do is take the boring bits of our jobs, giving us back more time. And if we, as with all technological innovation through time, it takes a few jobs, but it also generates massive productivity gains, which actually allow for real pay growth. So we get, in aggregate, we get richer through productivity gains. And if you are more productive in your job, you can be paid more and get, let's say, 2 hours a week of time back. What are you going to do with that time? Are you going to volunteer? Are you going to do something creative? Are you going to go out and consume goods and services in the wider economy? All of these are good things, but I can understand the concern around AI and its impact. I mean, we'll leave aside whether it's going to come and robot armies kill us all. We'll leave that for today. But what about the job stealing capacity? So I tested this out with my own job, and this is what I asked it to do: write a research note changing a forecast for no further rate rises from the Bank of England to 2 more rate rises. Unfortunately, a job I've had to do more times than I care to remember over the last kind of year or so. So what did it come out with? Research note, revised forecast for Bank of England rate rises. And here is the text that it came out with. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing word by word, but suffice to say it had me somewhat alarmed, because this is pretty good work. I mean, it hasn't got all of the numbers right because it didn't have access to the latest historical data. It's got American spelling, but it knows why we'd be writing the note. It knows why we'd be changing our opinion. It knows why the Bank of England might do more rate rises than expected. And all in all, this is ChatGPT absolutely doing my job. But let's return to that positive spin, because actually this could be doing the boring bit of my job. ChatGPT gives me this. I then go back in, add a bit of color, add a bit of finesse, change those American spellings back to British ones, and hit publish. And now I've got my 2 hours back to maybe go and spend in the rest of the economy. That I think is more than enough in terms of my prepared remarks. I'm going to stop sharing these slides, and Roddy, we can move on to some Q&A.
Super, fine. I got to start you off with the unexpected thing that happened was Ukraine and the war, and the impact on top of coming after COVID on economies around the world. War obviously means that some people, certainly in the defense industry, make more money. Yet we haven't seen anything specific happening, as far as I'm aware, with those stocks. But what's your view on the unexpected things like Ukraine war on the economy, both in the UK and in the US?
Well, I think we've come through the challenge incredibly well. I think a lot more than anybody would have hoped for when Russia invaded Ukraine. We're talking about war in Europe. We're talking about massive increases in gas prices, gas supply being cut off almost completely, and essentially an attempt to sort of economic blackmail, which hasn't worked because we're not in recession. Inflation is coming back down, gas prices have come right back down, and we've all carried on and got through it. And I think it is testament. And as you say, there are always winners and losers in any situation. There will be companies that can take advantage of different circumstances. But really, it's a story of resilience. There will always be shocks and surprises. It's usually ones that you're not expecting. I mean, obviously there was some forewarning with that one, but go back 5 years ago and tell someone that this would have been the outlook. I suspect it would have been quite not on many people's forecast radar. So there will always be shocks and surprises. But when we talk to our business customers, they tell us we've always lived with this. There's always been something, and generally we get through it. And sure enough, once again, we have.
Yeah. One of the other things that you had mentioned was the impact of demographics, which is both true in the United States and in the UK, and the growing number of people who obviously will be retired, and the number of retirees who keep on working in one capacity or another. What's the impact of that on the figures that you've talked about?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of people entered early retirement in the pandemic because they saved a bit of money, and also they had a good long think about their life and realized it's quite nice to do less, and we all reassessed everything. And then unfortunately inflation came along and forced quite a few people back into the labour market. Generally speaking, as you say, demographic pressures will increase the burden on the state over time. We will have more and more older people taking money from the public purse and fewer younger people. And actually the birth rate numbers this year were quite alarming on that front. We did and without immigration as well, it's really quite a worry, again, notwithstanding all those possible changes around using AI and instead of people. But yeah, I think the challenge is now, I mean, obviously the UK government put some measures in the budget to try and tempt people back into the workplace. I'm not sure it's the government's place to tell people who are having a nice retirement they should get back to work, but it's about keeping people in the workplace and getting them to stay in longer. And part of that is going to be about ageism, because a lot of older people will try and go into the workplace and say, well, actually, no one wants to hire them. So I think that's part of the story as well. But that's going to be the challenge, is getting people to stay in the workplace for longer, particularly if they can afford not to be, because why would you?
Excellent. Okay, well, I'm going to look at some of the questions that we've got coming over from you. Giles Chance, writing from the south of France, he says, asked, are higher taxes necessary to solving the problem that you mentioned of inadequate investment on the supply side? And if yes, then is taxing wealthy people the best way to do this? Or is there a better way? And I, having returned from the United States of America yesterday, where this whole thing of whether you tax the better off or what you do is a big debate between the Republican Party, that doesn't seem to have much in terms of forward policy, and the Biden administration. What do you feel about that?
Well, it's not intuitive that taxing more is going to generate investment, but certainly I think some fiscal support does generate investment, and we see that in the US. Whether that comes from borrowing or whether it comes from taxing more, that role that Rachel Reeves is talking about and Joe Biden's talked about, has had some success in the US model. In terms of where you generate that taxation from, wealth tax is hard. It's hard because how do you assess someone's wealth in any real time? What if you've got, a cellar full of expensive wine? What if you've got a few works of art on your wall? How do you say at any given time what that's worth, and how you tax it? How often do you tax it? How often should I pay, tax on the works of art that are hanging in my library or whatever it is? So it's very difficult to work in reality, but there are certainly ways of reforming it. And like I say, there are inequalities out there. So, for example, you like I mentioned, you do nothing but earn money by being a landlord. You're paying much less tax than you do by working. So definitely, I think there's areas that can be looked at there. But I think we have to be careful that we don't go too far to stifling investment, right? Because investment obviously higher tax can risk doing that as well.
You said that it's a question of being optimistic or not, and you told me that you'd been briefing or having meetings with a number of business people. What was their reaction to, or how are they thinking about the current situation in the UK?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm lucky as an economist that I do get to speak to lots of businesses up and down the country. And they always put me in my place. They tell me economists are gloomy and you always too negative, and here we are getting on with everything. And you know, this morning I did an event where we had a number of corporate clients from the London area, and we asked them when they registered, you know, describe your feelings towards the growth outlook for the next kind of year or so, and 80% of them said they were either optimistic or very optimistic. Now, it may be that's what they want to tell their bank, because, you know, you want to paint a picture that everything's wonderful. But generally speaking, they are. And, you know, I talk to them about interest rates, for example, and they say, well, yeah, interest rates, it's not good. It's another challenge, but it's nothing compared with the energy spike last year or the labour market challenges that we've been through, inability to hire the people we need. And so, yeah, the businesses they just keep on getting through. And it gives me faith in the UK, actually. You know, you read all the news flow and you read the headlines and you see the inflation numbers that are too high and all of that. And then you go out and talk to businesses. And, you know, we might have had some volatile government in recent years, but UK businesses are doing innovative and interesting and creative things up and down the country. And that, I think, is ultimately what keeps us going.
We hear from David Wallace, who says, what an excellent talk, thank you. Can you, Liz, say anything about the Scottish economy in the context of the UK economy as a whole?
Well, it's not my specialist subject. What I will say, I mean, yeah, it's hard to know, actually. Obviously, you know, in terms of the fiscal picture, the Scottish economy has, in recent years, been a net recipient from the UK government, and that makes me worried in the sense of, you know, with the view to any independence. I realise that feels a bit of a distant prospect at the moment, but, you know, if you were to have an independent Scotland standing alone, obviously the ambition would be to join the EU, and that would be a positive, but also there is this huge fiscal deficit, which would be easily the biggest within the EU, which, you know, in some ways would be a non-starter, because the EU has rules about the size of deficits anyway. So I'm not totally up to speed, to be honest, on any kind of differences between Scottish growth and UK growth at the moment. I mean, certainly the same goes for Scottish companies, was what I was just saying around the companies that I talked to up and down the country. You know, I had a great trip to Edinburgh a few weeks ago, where I talked to Scottish companies who, again, are in great optimistic spirits. So, you know, as far as I can see, that story holds true as well. My worry would be on that government finance side.
Okay. Another question here from Martin Allen. He said, we don't have secured UK energy, food, housing and banking because of overseas ownership. Of course, that's particularly true in the energy and the water areas. Is that having an impact on our ability for the UK government to take independent decisions? Do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, like the question says, it's not really in the hands of the UK government, it's in the hands of the private sector. So the government, of course, has limited control over that. Having said that, they have the control via legislation. So when we talk about the sewage, part of that has been affected by government legislation. So I do think there are bits and pieces that the government can do, but I guess this is a consequence of privatization, is that the government, of course, loses a bit of control of that, and then still takes the blame when everything goes wrong, of course. So yeah, it is a worry around the energy security in particular, but these are big challenges.
We've just come off the G20 meeting, of course, in India, and there's this whole issue of the global south and its involvement. How much do these external events really have an impact on the UK economy, in your view?
Well, I think we are an interconnected global economy, and we've heard a lot of talk in recent times about deglobalization, and I think it's been more talk than action, actually. I think global trade volumes hit an all-time high last year, and we're constantly seeing these kind of global cooperation agreements. So the G20 you mentioned, there was this big new infrastructure plan, wasn't there, between the US and the EU and Saudi Arabia, I think, and then we have the BRICS and the cooperation there and the expansion of that grouping, and then you have the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And although, it might be some economies sidelining other economies, generally speaking, global cooperation is still very, very strong. So that means that we are all affected by what's going on everywhere else. Now, I think, one of the big questions for the UK at the moment is if we see a slowdown in China, the degree to which that affects us. And I'm tentatively going to say that that it's not too much of a worry for the UK, in the sense that we're not relying on exporting to China. It's it's a very small percentage actually of our trade at the moment, and actually we can benefit from a bit of deflation if that does turn out to be the consequence of a more challenging Chinese growth environment. Where it gets complicated is through the financial sector. So if you see that something big correction in Chinese markets and lots of global banks exposed to that, and then that turns into a broader global financial sector stress, then of course that then does start to affect us here in the UK. But I think of course we're affected, but to varying degrees depending on what's going on.
And I suppose more broadly, the UK in a post-Brexit scenario, there seems to be quite a lot of people having second thoughts about how sensible that really was to do that, decoupled itself from its largest trading partner, I guess, possibly after the US, which was Europe. To what extent do the events in Asia affect an economy like the UK one?
Sorry, the events in Asia?
Well, we, as the Asia-Scotland Institute, what we look at is the relationship between Scotland and Asia historically and economically. We are an island now, detached slightly from continental Europe. To what extent is your thinking about the UK economy affected by what's going on in other places in the world? Particularly, you bought Silicon Valley Bank at HSBC, a good deal, but you have to absorb that. But what are your reflections on the impact of external events on the UK economy?
I mean, like I say, it depends whether it's low level and that maybe Asian demand for our goods and services is a bit wobbly for a while, or if it's a global kind of financial sector kind of contagion issue. I mean, one of the points of, you mentioned Brexit, at the margin, it has reduced our exposure to Europe and increased our exposure to everyone else, or at least that was the plan. The plan was that, by being outside of the EU, we would be able to do our trade deals with other economies further afield. And, so insofar as, we hope to benefit from things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it matters how well those economies are doing. And as emerging markets, of course, we expect to see continued growth, not necessarily linear. Every year is going to be 5% all nice and tidy, but generally over the years of the decades, those economies have much more growth and catch up potential, which of course the UK hopefully can benefit from. But of course, that feels quite nebulous at the time. At the moment, you have to. It's a multi-decade kind of story, and in the meantime, I think we mentioned Brexit, that has had a much more immediate and painful impact on the economy, and there's no getting away from that.
You talked about the elections here in 2024. Of course, there are other elections taking place in the United States of America. What does the outcome of those elections signify, without getting yourself in too much hot water? There's Trump and the Biden approach to life. And it seemed to me that the Biden administration had at least rebuilt a number of the links and relationships with other parts of the world, which Donald Trump had destroyed or certainly affected adversely. Do you factor that into your forecasts?
Well, it's hard to factor in a sort of change of government when we just simply can't really rely on knowing what's going to happen. To some degree, I think politicians get a lot more credit and blame for economic cycles than they really deserve. Often you'll hear politicians saying, I created this many jobs. And you think, well, you didn't create them, but you presided over an economic cycle that created them. In the case of Joe Biden and Donald Trump, actually, they've both provided a lot of support into the economy, which has meant that the US economy, in the post-pandemic recovery, has been light years ahead of everybody else's. The US economy is something like 6% bigger than pre-pandemic, where the rest of us are kind of tottering around. We've completed the V-shaped recovery, but not got much further. So, that has been a very interventionist approach by both, Donald Trump with his tax cuts and his pandemic stimulus, and then Joe Biden with his policies after that. From a UK perspective, Donald Trump was a big fan of Brexit and was told us we'd be top of the queue for a trade deal, and a US-UK trade deal would be huge news. Since we've had Joe Biden in place, of course, that's gone off the table, and nobody, I think even the most optimistic of kind of people on that front don't seem to think that a US-UK trade deal is on the cards at all at the moment. And obviously with a second Biden term, I presume that remains the case. I don't know. It doesn't look like a Donald Trump government is on another Donald Trump government is on the cards, but if it was, then it might open that door back open to a US-UK trade deal, which would be a big deal.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. And am I right that we've recently in the process, hopefully, of signing a deal with Singapore or endeavouring to do so? I think Rishi Sunak had talked about that.
Yeah, lots of things in the pipeline. I think that certainly is one of them, and these things are all incrementally helpful. I mean, sometimes you see the estimates and it says this will increase UK GDP by 0.1% over a decade, and you think, well, it grew 0.5% last month. So, often these things do look quite small, but they're all incrementally helpful, and that's another one of them. Yeah.
And I guess another question that other people ask is, what are the greatest threats, in your view, to the UK economy, that things may not turn out as you necessarily predict at the moment?
Well, I think what worries me a bit is another energy shock, and if you think about what happened in the 1970s, I think is they thought they'd got inflation under control, and then you had a big energy shock with the oil crisis. Now, I'm not saying we're looking at anything like that, but we kind of got away with the energy story last winter, partly because we had a very mild winter, and partly because we all did a great job diversifying away. The Germans did use lots more coal. I think we used lots more renewables, and that worked. But if you were to have a very cold winter, then I would be worried about our energy security. I don't think we've made a lot of progress in terms of ensuring our security in the event of another spike. So that worries me. And then it's just the other one is the labour market. So we've been through a very strong period of demand for labour, to the point where, like I said, companies haven't been able to find the people they need, and they're paying them much more to people have been getting great pay rises to join firms. The theory has been that strength won't turn around very quickly, and because if you've had such trouble hiring, you don't then want to let people go unless you absolutely have to, because what we found in the pandemic was, things like, for example, the airports, they let all the baggage handlers go in the bad times, and then they turned around in the good times in the recovery, and they were gone, and it caused all that chaos. And that's just one example. So the theory is that firms will learn that lesson and will hoard labour, and we won't see a big rise in the unemployment rate. But if that theory is wrong, and we do start to see the unemployment rate push up, and like I said, it has already risen a bit more than I probably would have expected it to, then that kind of changes everything. It changes the outlook for demand in the economy. It changes outlook for inflation, interest rates, and also for the housing market, because I think the housing market could be a big risk as well. At the moment, we're quite sanguine because supply of housing's really weak, as well as demand. So that kind of puts a floor under prices. But if unemployment goes up, you get forced sales, because it's not a case of I can pay my mortgage, I just have to forego a holiday or a meal out. It's a case of I cannot pay my mortgage, I've got to put my house on the market, and my neighbours lost their job, so they're putting their house on the market, and then you get the forced sales, and that's when the wheels come off and it all goes wrong. So the unemployment rate is the indicator that I have my eye on most closely. I think we can muddle through this scenario, but that's the one to watch.
I suppose another challenge is getting the general public to to recognize what the opportunities and challenges are. It's a communication challenge that governments both sides of the Atlantic seem to have, which is, for example, in the United States of America, very few of the so-called achievements of the Biden administration seem to be acknowledged by the general public, which is why the administration still gets quite low polling. Even though by any measure, I guess they have achieved quite a lot. And certainly, for example, in the area of infrastructure, spending money on infrastructure, which the UK government needs to do, and some of the infrastructure-related challenges like HS2 are on very wobbly ground, it appears. Do you, I mean, again, talking to business people as you do people get the message, or do they make their own interpretations, or should governments do more, certainly in the democracy, to let people know what it is they have achieved and what they're endeavouring to do?
Yeah, I don't think there's how can I focus? I don't think there's a lot of enthusiasm around in the business community at the current policy environment. And in some ways, we have to say this government has had a lot of challenges to deal with. They've had COVID and the energy shock, and they have responded to those. So you might think that we'd be a bit more thankful for that. The amount of money that was thrown at households and businesses in both of those shocks, has been huge, and the government has risen to that challenge. And in fact, some people are starting to question that and say, actually, well, should the government, going back to the invisible hand, should the government cushion every blow, and do we now expect it ad infinitum? If anything bad happens, we'll expect the government to come along and make it better. But the government has obviously done that. But in terms of a wider policy agenda, this government has been firefighting not only the massive global events that it could do nothing about, but also the scandals within the party, the changes of leadership, the changes of ministers. And I think that's been very disruptive for businesses. They found it very unpredictable. And I think, like I said, some stability after the election would be very welcome. And yeah, a government with a growth plan, a government with some concrete steps will be very welcome indeed. And then I think that will be recognised.
Well, thanks, Liz, very much. I think that's exhausted most of the questions that the people following us today had. And having you speak is extremely interesting. It gives lie to the statement, which is a bit unfair, that you can lay all the economists in the world end to end and never come to a conclusion. But I think you have come to a conclusion on a number of factors. And it's great to have been able to share this almost an hour with you and with the others following. And we are enormously grateful to you. And we hope for a continued robust conversation with our new panel on September the 20th, when we look at artificial intelligence and its impact. And AI, or ChatGPT's response to your question about the future, financial future, was extremely interesting. A bit worrying that they came up with an answer so fast, but glad that you were able to improve on their offering. So thank you again so much. Thanks to those who've been listening and our other followers. This will go up on YouTube. And please remember that these things are possible with your support, and without it, they're not. So to everybody, thanks, and especially, Liz, to you. Thank you for giving up some of your time today. Very interesting.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you.